Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. For those of you who do not know what Impetus Digital is we're a company that has built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools. And we work with a series of life science companies, be it pharmaceutical, medical device, biotech, and we help them to virtualize their traditional in-person meetings, be it advisory boards, investigator meetings, co-author groups. And since COVID-19, unfortunately, a lot of their sales and MSL training and their brand plan rollouts, now we've actually been doing a lot of things as well around big conventions and congresses. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a thought. And from a thought comes a courageous conversation. And we're really looking forward to helping our clients getting past these beyond the pill conversations into these more provocative, hairy, audacious discussions like the ones that we're having with Randi, so that we can actually help to all collectively positively disrupt healthcare. And it really is the impetus, if you will, behind these discussions that we're having. We want to use our platform to be able to start doing things differently, more bleeding edge, inviting things like new technologies and thinking and leadership ideas into the day-to-day. So I'm really pleased and honored and happy to have Randi Goeckeler on the call with us today. She is actually an astounding visionary leader with extensive experience in multiple therapeutic areas in the pharmaceutical industry. She has held many leadership roles at a variety of pharmaceutical companies over the years. It's including Allergan, Sanofi, Pfizer. She's worked at Boehringer Ingelheim and as well at Bristol Myers Squibb. So she's obviously got a lot to share with us. Randi is a proven success in not only innovating, but developing and executing strategic engagement frameworks that have helped to drive scientific communications with therapeutic knowledge. And she's helped to impact the product launch readiness and commercial successes of a variety of products. She has led teams with a vision to build some of the best-in-class cultures, and she's helped to sort of do that by combining her business expertise with some of her scientific strategic thinking and her leadership skills. And with all of that, she's been able to deliver really impactful outcomes to the R&D departments, medical affairs, as well as to help commercial deem their goals and objectives. So really excited to have Randi with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me today, Natalie.
That's awesome. So one of the things that's really interesting as somebody sort of delves into your career, Randi, is that you have a ton of experience in stakeholder relations with some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies throughout your career. So tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this particular field of work.
Sure. So I think that many of us don't have the most straight path forward to medical affairs. I think that oftentimes we come by it in a number of different ways. My route was through, I'm a trained social worker and specific to oncology. And so I started in the sort of the patient arena, and from there moved into patient advocacy and then into stakeholder relations from a HCP and other external stakeholders. So I think what got me interested in the stakeholder was that I felt that there was a missing piece that a social worker skill or a person who does, is really a connector within the organization can really help to bring all of the insights internally and externally and sort of pair them up and match them up in a way that could create a more meaningful set of business objectives and bring all folks together. And so I guess by nature, I'm just a connector.
I think that's really, really interesting. And I think it's outstanding about starting in a clinical background like that, Randi, and having, because these days we talk a lot about patient centricity. Mm-hmm. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people have never really necessarily walked in the shoes and been really super close to actual consumers of health. Outside of, being sort of in the ivory tower, if you will, in the pharmaceutical marketing or sales department. And so I think it really pays tribute the fact that you've really walked in the shoes. So when you say connector, what were some of those key lessons learned that you have found as you've tried to help your clients navigate through murky quagmires and difficult understandings of, how to get their treatments or to get their drugs or to get access to certain things? Tell us a little bit about what that connector does for those purposes.
Sure. So there's a few things, and I speak to folks a lot, whether the size of the organization is large or small. That really almost doesn't matter, whether you're an N of 1 or an N of 10. What's really important is that you generate from the work that you're doing with your external as well as internal stakeholders diversity of thought. If you don't bring the diversity of thought of the patient and the payer, or a C-suite executive, or a global physician or a community physician, if you don't bring that diversity of thought externally, and you don't bring the diversity of thought internally, R&D, ClinOps, medical affairs, commercial, HEOR, depending upon where it sits, if you don't start to bring all of those pieces together, you're really never going to get the richness of what you're trying to achieve. So that connector skill comes first and foremost in generating the diversity of thought. I think the other thing that's important once you've generated that diversity of thought is looking at your end goal. And your end goal as that connector, if you will, is always to establish those mutually beneficial partnerships. Those partnerships are critical to the success of not only the organization, but going back to the patient, to the care of the patient, because it's those stakeholders that really will take on the opportunities to look at new drugs or take on the opportunities to look at things in a different paradigm, and that will ultimately benefit the patient. Internally, one of the connector roles that I've often had to serve in, as have my team members, is because this role is relatively unique, you need to function and serve as a cultural change agent. Folks don't always get it. And so you really need to be that change champion. And again, that's another sort of connector skill. And lastly, I would say as a connector, you need to ensure that there's really good cross-functional collaboration and transparency. You need to not only connect the tactics and the strategies, but you need to communicate back in a transparent manner. And all of those sort of bits and pieces fall within that connector network.
It's outstanding, and I want to linger on some of those because there's a lot of really big crunchy things at each of those threads, if you will. And so the first one really has to do with this whole concept of how we are working in silos. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things I think is very important in the pharma space is that there's a division that's considered commercial, and then there's a whole other division that's considered medical. And sometimes there's a chasm in between depending on internal regulations, compliance, culture. Tell us a little bit about some of that frontier work that you have tried to indulge in. And again, we haven't even gone to the customer. We haven't even gone to the client or the consumer or the patient yet. We're just dealing with these silos internally. Tell us a little bit about what those look like and why sometimes those silos are so difficult to break down.
So there's a few pieces here. I think the first thing is that you have to have strong leadership support. If you don't have really strong leadership support, it goes back to being that cultural change agent. You really can't begin to break down those silos and make the change. So from the top, there has to be enough senior leadership support that says this is something that they are aligned to and believe is part of your long-term mission and vision. If you don't have that, it's a really hard uphill battle. If you can start to garner that even with one person, then the next really big piece is to start to look in terms of breaking down the silos. In the organizations that I've been in, people often fall to the sound bites of, well, this isn't compliant, right? And so it can be compliant. And so the next really big bucket of opportunity comes in working really closely with your compliance partners so that they can really understand what you're trying to achieve. Again, you would do that in a cross-functional manner with the right people in the room, including legal and compliance, to help you to do, to achieve that and to reach those, to start to pull down those barriers and sort of reach across the table, if you will. The one thing that I found that really helped when we frame out this compliance conversation is the discussion around understanding what your guardrails are and ensuring, if you're a team lead or if you're an N of one, that you follow those guardrails really carefully. And for me and the team, we've always stayed on the right side of the guardrails and stayed in a really safe space by focusing on the physician or the stakeholder and their expertise. And we did not work towards understanding what were some of the sales goals and the individual contributions of a physician, as an example, nor did we get involved in selecting a physician on the medical side for a clinical study or IST. We would provide nominations on both sides of the table, commercial and medical, but we stayed focused on what the expert could bring to the table that would ensure that the goals and objectives of the activity were met, and we pushed away those other issues and let those stay within the domain of the commercial and medical colleagues. That really helped and got us in a good place.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of really intuitive, very smart and strategic playing in a field that could potentially have a lot of landmines. So there's a lot there, and there's obviously a ton of expertise that's required to understand how to do that effectively. Now, you also brought up this idea of culture, and a huge component of the effectiveness or the, like you said, the riverbanks that are really brought forward by the leadership team has a lot to do with the mindset, with the belief systems of all of those people in the C-suite. And so when we talk about culture and we talk about innovation, we also at the same time have to consider the concept of fear. Sometimes leadership can speak from two sides of their mouth. On the one hand, yes, go forth and be creative. And on the other side is, as soon as we can't fail, people will get crucified and people will see the skeletons hanging in the closet. So with that careful navigation where you're sort of cascading through that carefully through those riverbanks and making sure that you sort of stay, nonpartisan to any particular way or form, but what's really in the best interest of the patient, is how have you affected change at the leadership level and in amidst the day-to-day frontline workers who oftentimes are mired by fear and fear of innovating?
So I don't have a straightforward answer, other than to say you need to have a really good EQ and really understand the culture and the tempo of the organization at the baseline. That's really what you need to do. And you really need to find those champions. And if I was starting as either a consultant or starting on a new team, it's really critical to have some good listening tours and really understand what the needs and what the vision is for the individual leadership. When you've when you've listened for a while, you can begin to start to frame out what a strategy might look like. And that's when I'm a very strong advocate, as you can see from some of the work that I've done over the years, on what an integrated plan looks like. And that's when you really begin to bring those collective visions together. You listen to the individual thoughts and then you pull them together and you start to create a story that you all can live with. And that's when the buy-in and the magic starts to happen. But you have to start one at a time and then bring them all together. Now, if you're really lucky, somebody, and I've been lucky in many times in my career, I was brought in because somebody understood that to begin with and was an advocate from the start. But if you don't have that advocate from the start, you have to begin by listening and understanding what their goals and objectives are on an individual basis. And that includes getting 15 minutes with the CEO of the organization.
Very, very interesting. We can learn a lot from big tech entrepreneurs who've done extremely well, one of them being Jeff Bezos, obviously with Amazon, and his obsession with the end user, with the client, with the customer. And, when we actually struggle with what's right and wrong and what's compliant, what's legal, keeping the eye on the ball of the client, of the consumer, of the patient can never steer you wrong. So as we're sort of looking at this, tell us a little bit about how patient centricity has really been incorporated as part of your thinking and really this concept of the integrated strategic plan.
Sure. So when I talk about listening and really understanding who your internal constituents are, it's really important that you spend some time with anybody that has a role within patient advocacy, whether it's advocacy related as a function within the organization or somebody that has it as a subset. That's going to be really critical, because trying to create the patient centricity in isolation after I just finished talking about how strong collaboration isn't going to work. You've got to make sure that you have those advocates at the table, and I mean those internal stakeholder advocates that support the patient viewpoint. Because what you often find is that there are a number of people that are working in a number of different ways, and part of this role is really about pulling them together. So the short story is there may work that's already been done. The important piece is really to listen to what the internal stakeholder is saying, and then get out there and listen to those external stakeholders. Meet with the patient advocacy leaders, meet with physicians that have a very strong patient voice, meet with professionals that focus in on the patient, and meet with patients. Going back to what I was saying about diversity of thought, the only way you can really bring that patient centricity into the organization is to listen to what they have to say, and then take what they have to say, again, going back to my plan, and integrate those thoughts, whether they are barriers, whether they're goals and opportunities, or whether they're just simply some watch outs, or just some would like to have a bit of dreaming, if you will. And you need to incorporate that into that plan. So then when you get everybody in the room together, that patient centricity is already baked into the opportunity.
Very interesting. Another key thing that you and I spoke about when we first started chatting is a term that oftentimes gets knocked around, but has so much relevance, and it's such a prolific and eloquent concept when integrated effectively into these integrative systematic plans. And that is really around systems thinking or systems innovations. And so the idea around systems thinking, it's almost like integrative decision making. It's taking a holistic view at the bigger picture as opposed to the individual parts and trying to figure out each component. Tell us a little bit about how you have indulged in systems thinking and how that type of agile thinking has impacted some of those plans that you've worked on with the teams and the organizations you have participated in.
So I guess I have two comments on that. I think the first one is, and this is sort of I believe a must-have in all the questions that you're asking me and in the work that I do. I think it's really important that you identify a few thought partners to help you. And those people within the organization, or even perhaps outside the organization, that really you can use as a sounding board. And we often hear folks in terms of our career development talk about assembling the board of directors. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a person that you trust and really believe and have good respect for, that you can have those conversations with. So I think that before I can even answer the systems question, I want to just make sure that people find those thought partners, because it's a very valuable tool to have within your toolkit within the organization. So now onto the specifics of the question. I think one of the things that's been a real systems thinking opportunity beyond the integrated plan, because that's just sort of the roadmap, if you will, is really trying to figure out what are those right IT and software related pieces. I'm going to focus in on that because I want to be really practical in some of the solutions that I can help the folks on listening and or watching the YouTube today. And you really need to figure out what your organization has the resources for and how you're going to create the right IT solutions. And there's a lot of wonderful solutions out there, but you've got to find a way in sort of the systems thinking to ensure that there's transparency, because what happens is, it goes back to our conversation about the silos, and when the lens is that I look at the work that we do every day, everybody is going to run out and create those engagements with those physicians. But if we don't know what's going on, when it comes down to the field, whether it's the commercial field or the field medical liaison, if they've had an engagement with the physician and they don't know about it, then it's really, it's very cumbersome and they trip over themselves. So whether the solutions are, and there's a lot of them out there, whether it's Viva or Monaco or System Analytics and all the tools that are H1, all the tools that are out there then, and vendors that I've worked with in the past, you need to really understand what your organization has the capacity for and the ability to work through those solutions. And if all else fails, a spreadsheet and a share room is some of the very basic ways that you can begin to create the systemic thinking and the systemic transparency between one engagement and another engagement. Because a lot of times, even in small organizations, because everybody's running so quickly, they don't take the time to share the information. So that's critically important. You can't advance the client. You can't be, as you asked the question before about Jeff Bezos and Amazon, you can't put yourself in the shoes of the customer unless you understand the whole customer experience. And you can't understand that unless you see all the interactions. And so that's really important.
So I'm actually also just curious, just concretely, if somebody is listening to this and wanting to understand, I want to create a stakeholder plan, or I want to create one of these integrative communication plans. Sometimes these plans can sound very airy-fairy, especially to people in the field who are doing something concrete every day. They're out hitting the pavement. Well, not so much any like lately, but they're out doing the practical things. They're out slogging it out and, you know, doing the calls and all that sort of stuff. And then they look at individuals, you know, who are working on these integrated plans as being these airy-fairy, you know, ivory tower thinking, oh, well, I hope it just disappears somewhere and, you know, maybe somebody will forget about it one day. How do you bring, and we talked earlier about communication, how do we make these living, breathing plans? And is there a methodology to continually look at them, reframe them? Because we have oftentimes suffered in the pharmaceutical business of doing these brand plans annually, these strategic plans with these critical success factors. They kind of get put into folders and, you know, very unlikely to be looked at again until the next time you got to pull them off the virtual shelf. So how do you make these real and live for people?
Sure. So one of the things I'll recommend is that if anybody wants to just check out my LinkedIn profile, I put in an infographic on the profile. And the infographic is about your question, Natalie, because I get a lot of questions about, I don't understand it. It all sounds good, but what does it look like? And so I decided a seeing is believing approach. And so there's an infographic that I created to help explain that. So that may be a tool that folks can use and use it as you need to tell their story and to continually address the issues. So there was a lot of questions in there. I do have a sort of framework and methodology that I like to implement, but I think at the core of it is it has to be owned by one person. And that ownership can't be something that you write and put on a shelf and then brush it off the following October and say, oh, we have to write next year's plan. It has to live and breathe every day with you because it is your roadmap. It is, and if you look at the infographic, it is actually a roadmap. It is your roadmap to how you're going to be successful. And one of the things that I've been asked a lot about, and I'm going to just go to another subject and then sort of come back to it, is that in this era of COVID, some folks have been asking me, would things be different if, what would you do differently, or how would COVID impact your engagements? And I go back to saying that if you had a plan and everything wasn't transactional and there was a strategy behind it, then you would have a better idea of how you're going to continue the engagements with those physicians, as an example, because you'll know what you wanted to achieve with each one of them. But in the absence of a plan, what you land up with is a series of transactional engagements. Then COVID hits, and you just have a host of Zoom engagements that don't really drive towards a full strategy, when there were probably, if you sat down, a number of other things you can do with the plan in mind to help guide you as to other alternative strategies. But in the end, one person needs to own the plan, and one person has to be accountable for how that plan is going to live and breathe. And the plan should be reviewed quarterly. It can be reviewed monthly if the market dynamics are changing and a competitor came in or something happened with a particular study, positive or negative, that's going to alter your plan. So I think that it has to be owned by someone. It needs to be visited frequently, and it needs to live and breathe. It needs to be watered and fed. It can't be something that you just write and put away, because it is going to guide you to what you're going to have to do in the following year, and or guide you through barriers and crises that may come throughout the year.
Yeah, such a well construed and important point, because again, there's probably in the future going to be other pandemics and other crises. And so the living, breathing, strategic plan that can be nimble and agile is so absolutely essential. So let's actually, we would be remiss not to get into a fairly robust discussion around COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on the world, in the pharmaceutical industry, and even on the strategic, agile, integrated plans that we're talking about here. So pre-COVID versus post-COVID, we're actually talking about living, breathing plans, integrating them in the day-to-day, being able to work as a team, commercial, medical, other cross-functional groups in a diverse environment with multiple opinions. What did that world look like prior to COVID? And did we see something different happen from a technological sharing standpoint that either helps or hinders that communication, especially as it comes down to the strategic plan? What do you sort of see, or are you seeing happening or could happen with communication between internal team members with technology?
So look, I think you have to work harder at being far more transparent. I talked about that earlier, and whether that's going back to getting on the phone or information, a Zoom call, information in the share room, I think you have to be uber transparent, because again, now we're really, not only are we siloed, if you think about how the organizations are configured and the infrastructure, but now we're also isolated, right? So we don't have those hallway conversations. We don't have the chance to bump into somebody and say, hey, you know, I just met with Dr. So-and-so, and I really just wanted to catch you up. Do you mind if we just take a quick walking meeting, and I want to just give you an update on what's going on? You're missing those opportunities. So you have to create them by ensuring that there's good transparency between your internal colleagues and the engagements that are taking place externally. Externally, I would begin to sort of tease out, of course, it's always first and foremost in our minds, make sure everybody's doing well, right? We want to make sure that everybody's, safe when you're communicating with your external stakeholder. I also think that we're trying to move, it almost some days feels like through yogurt, right? It's really hard to keep pressing because there's so much uncertainty about when the world's going to re-engage. And so what I've asked my teams to do over the first few months of COVID prior to leaving Allergan was that I really wanted to talk to them and ask them a few key questions. And what we were thinking about is that, and I think this is really important, and it goes back to the plan. One, I think it's important to ask yourself, what in the plan are you going to sort of ramp up and accelerate? What were the things that you believe you can do that you were sort of going to go at a mild pace, but now you really believe they need to be ramped up? Two, what do you want to continue to do? And what in your plan you need to initiate because you had no idea this was going to happen and the work isn't going to be complete. And what I challenge my team to begin to think about, what were some of the 4 or 5 key themes of the kinds of dialogues that they were going to have, say, at a Congress, and ask themselves questions about whether they can be reinvented. So if you're going to say, for example, and I'm getting super tactical, and so I'll just give a few examples, but we can tease them out if you think they're helpful. If, say, for example, you're going to meet a set of physicians at a conference, maybe now what you need to do is, and you can't, right? Maybe you can do some of it via Zoom. Maybe now you need to really accelerate work that you might have been doing with digital opinion leaders, or accelerate work that you might have done in terms of creating, when we can get back together, small roundtables where we can bring a few physicians together, invite them into your organization when we can. And if you can't invite them because there's no ability to travel by air, look in your geography and find those important customers and or patients that when you can get back into the office, you can bring them into your corporate headquarters or into your facilities and begin to engage. If that doesn't work, you can always try to go out to the health systems, which is always a little bit more difficult in terms of the sort of the parameters that they have around visitors, et cetera. But find new ways to engage and move beyond that transactional opportunity.
So you're talking about longitudinal, long-term touch points over time and building advocacy, relationship, authentic partnership. Do you see that technology will actually enable or disable that? What has your experience been with leveraging technology for ongoing engagements?
You know, I was talking to somebody about that on Friday before the long weekend, and he gave a really good analogy. You can't expect, if you had a Word document, you can't expect it to write the book, right? The Word document won't write the book. It's the content, and it's the strategy behind the author that's going to take the words in your head and put them on the page, if you will. It's the same sort of thing when I look at technology, whether it's Zoom or Teams or any of the other sort of digital tools that are out there. I think it's not, in my mind, it's not the vehicle that's critical that needs to be re-challenged and can support or not support. It's what you're going to do with the content and how you're going to use it in a meaningful way. The technology is there because it's a help, but it's the tool. It's not the methodology to achieve engagement. That has to come from the content. And so I think tools are important, and I think that they're essential. And it's the only thing that we have right now in terms of our technology is to do these types of engagements. And I think they're working well, but it's what you do with the content that will really drive towards making a meaningful engagement. And that's why I went back to the conversation about what do you want to initiate, what do you want to accelerate, and what do you want to continue? Because that will change perhaps how the content will be delivered via some of these technologies.
So the world that we live in as it relates to the pharmaceutical industry and who they have been routinely engaging with in terms of prescribers has certainly changed over the last 10, 15 years. It has gone from the typical physician, we go to see a physician, we influence them, we show them clinical studies, they make a decision, and they prescribe to patients. It was a fairly straightforward interaction. The world has become very complex and very diverse. There's many people and many players at the decision-making table, including administrators, payers, patients, allied healthcare providers, etc. In your opinion, do you think this new world of the new digitized world or the new digital revolution has democratized who pharma is engaging with? In other words, is this an opportunity for new digital opinion leaders? In the traditional sense, we have gone to the same people doing the same things over and over because they were the key influencers. But now, with an opportunity of digital, are we opening the door to nurses becoming key opinion leaders, or this particular patient in Iowa or in some other part of the country that normally doesn't come to these in-person meetings? How do you see technology being leveraged to democratize and or modify what we consider to be an opinion leader?
Sure. I think, I get asked that question, not so eloquently, Natalie, but I get asked that question often about the role of the digital opinion leader. And it's new work that I've just started to do and my team has just started to do, but I think that it is the answer. It is the answer to diversity of thought, diversity of information by geography, and diversity of community, things that we might not have ever been able to capture. But one of the things that's important is really to understand the difference between a digital opinion leader and a social influencer, and within your organization, and what that actually means to your organization. In my world, the digital opinion leader is a healthcare professional that's separate and apart from their practice and their day-to-day activities as maybe a practicing clinician, has an online presence where they're sharing information. And it is not necessarily information that we have contracted as an organization that they would work with, that or paid celebrity. That would be more of sort of a contracted influencer. A true digital opinion leader has independent thoughts and independent information that they're going to exchange. And when we begin to look at the digital opinion leader, we really begin to expand the cohort of opportunities of HCPs or other influencers in other therapeutic or HEOR or economics or any of the other sort of offshoots of that expert or that HCP expert. And so that's critically important. The other thing that it does from an education perspective that I think is really important is when that digital opinion leader has a tremendous sort of reach and following, it allows for physicians community physicians and local physicians that may never have the opportunity to engage with those academic or those Congress-related activities. And if those insights from a Congress are shared from a digital opinion leader, it emanates down to the community. And we're really beginning to create a tremendous amount of education and information exchange between sort of some of those academic influencers and or those digital opinion leaders and the community physician. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity and a wonderful way to create greater engagement and information exchange and education.
Beautifully said, and couldn't agree with you more on that, Randi. So when we're looking at the integration of digital, and quite frankly, there probably could be a debate going on about are we ever going to go back? Can we ever go back? Or are we now on this road of digitization and digitalization forever and a day moving forward? It does beg the question about the roles that we have, the traditional roles that we've incorporated in the pharma business. So the question comes down to is, what is it going to mean moving forward to be a sales rep at a pharma company? What is a medical science liaison's role? What is the marketing person going to be doing moving forward? All of this under the light and the question of, now that you've gone digital and you're no longer cloistered or mired in the constraints associated with time differences or time zones or language barriers, you're now potentially global. Does this change the definition of positions, skill sets, and of really what a pharmaceutical company is, either as an affiliate or as a global team? Do we need to start this discourse and this conversation?
So this is clearly my own opinion. I don't have enough data to really answer that question. I don't know that there's enough data out there yet. My hope would be that we would take the best of both worlds and blend them together. That it's not, I'm not an extremist in any way. I really believe in a collaborative and diverse set of decision making in order to come up with a solution. And so when you ask me that question, I would say that it has to be a combination of both. We have learned how to cope in this environment and in this world where digital engagements, digital opinion leaders, Zoom calls, as we were discussing before, or other video conferencing is become the norm. I don't believe that it'll ever replace a face-to-face engagement where you can really understand, and there's something very special about sitting down with a colleague and sharing a cup of coffee and having a conversation and really getting to know all the informality of the relationship that gets lost in sort of our digital engagements. And so I do believe that it will be a combination of the two. Again, I go back to have a strategy. If you know what you want to do, you'll really be able to understand when it's the right time to engage digitally and when it's the right time to engage in a face-to-face. And when you've got a full plan and you look at each one of your physicians and you know what you're going to do with them and how you're going to engage as an organization, you can begin to understand that there'll be a little bit of digital, and there's going to be a little bit of face-to-face. There'll be a little bit of advisory or group meetings, and you can really begin to strategize how and when you're going to use the right tools for that right engagement. I don't think it's going to be one or the other anymore. I think we're more comfortable now than we were in the past. And I think that will just make for greater diversity, greater opportunity, and a greater strategy for engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
Yeah.
It does make one wonder, as we're sort of, everything is tossed in this big salad of the new normal, whatever that looks like. And we're all just trying to crawl out of this craziness right now. And everything's getting thrown into this world, including the kitchen sink. We've got, economic upheaval and social unrest, and we've got climate changes, and it's a big ball of fun. So it doesn't prevent us from sort of throwing in even more into the fire, which is just some interesting questions, which is, what is going to be the future of the pharmaceutical business model? Currently, it's about creating chemical entities. That's really what it is. We create pills. And so with everybody clamoring towards healthcare as being the next big, quote unquote, disruptable industry, including big electronics companies and big tech companies, you see regulatory departments scrambling towards, improving and accelerating legislation on software as a medical device and incorporating things like digital therapeutics. And now the healthcare agenda is become politicized and become very much part of the agenda. Is it safe to say that the world is going to change with pharma, that the way we have companies, is there a place where we're going to see huge mergers and acquisitions into a few big players and a few monopolies like we see in the tech space? Do we see pharma companies working alongside these big tech companies? What do you sort of foresee as being some of the future of where pharma is and maybe should be heading?
So we're going to go back to the beginning of our conversation. It has to focus on the patient, right? Everything we do has to focus on the patient. And so for me, I think the answer is yes. I think that we can be and have this opportunity now to create great disruption in the healthcare space and create it in a positive way that will positively impact the patient. With all the things we've been talking about, with technology, with the tools, with finding ways to create affordable medicine that's sustainable for all patients so that all patients can receive the drugs and the medications that they need. And the pharma companies can still make a very respectable profit. I think that if we stay focused on the patient, you talked before about the beyond the pill. In my mind, it goes back to listening to our business partners, understanding what their needs are, getting diverse thought in terms of how and who we want to partner with, technology partners, talked about the digital opinion leader, patient advocacy groups, and bringing all of those partners together to create what's most important to serve the patient, because that's why we're there. That is always the North Star. If the patient isn't at the front of our minds, then we've taken a wrong turn. And so for me, it would be using the patient as that North Star, that endpoint, to bring together all the right parties to deliver the best possible care to them. And that would be my wish for 2021 and beyond.
I love that, Randy, and I so appreciate that that's the why and should be the why behind everything that's done. So absolutely eloquently said. With the patient being the central component, it starts to bring up a whole series of really interesting changes, modifications, opportunities. One of them being that I've heard recently is that pharma companies are now starting to really navigate if they can't get to see physicians because they can't go in and there's all kinds of stipulations, they're going to go straight to the patient. Direct to consumer marketing is going to have this huge upswing. What can be said, what shouldn't be said, and how patients are really going to become part of the discourse and the conversation and the development of programs. They're going to become the new key opinion leaders, digital thought leaders, the ones who are potentially going to also have a voice on clinical studies that are selected, picked, chosen. Maybe they're going to have access to global clinical trials as opposed to the ones that are just regionally available. Tell us a little bit about where you think the patient is going to play around clinical studies, entering their own data into data inputs, and having these direct conversations with pharma moving forward.
So I believe, in what I just said, that the patient at the center and bringing together the right voices, which I talked earlier about having the right thought partners, having diversity of thought. I think that bringing that patient voice into everything that you do is critically important. One example was when we were at the Allergan, we had the patient as our number one focus, and that was our primary goal. And so one of the things that I've done, and this is a switch gears a little bit, but I think it's very practical, is that when I built my stakeholder relations team, and I had the luxury of building a team from the bottom up when I joined Allergan, I ensured that I put a patient advocate on my team so that they had another set of skills. When I hire folks, I really like to think of them as having a +1 superpower. And when I evaluate each one of the candidates to join my team, I think about what their +1 superpower is. And I would encourage everyone to think along similar lines in terms of whether it's a +1 superpower or whatever language you want to use, but ensure that the voice of the patient is on your team. And so what I did was hired somebody that had a very strong and long history in patient advocacy so that they can always ask that question when we were making a decision about what to do. What will the patient say? It's not always possible to have a patient in the room or call a patient or have the engagement of the patient, but if you can bring the patient voice into your team, if there isn't such a person, then I think it's important to work through even HR and and your own personal network to find the person that has passion for the patient and ensure that that person has a voice. Again, I go back to that cross-functional team, to have that opportunity to bring the voice of the patient into every decision that we make within the organization. And when we begin to do that, at least on my stakeholder relations team, it really, I almost could predict that this individual is going to raise their hand and say, wait a minute, what's the patient going to say about this, right? And so it really helped us to stay grounded in where our North Star was and where our goals were. And so I may not have answered the question on the largest scale, but I wanted to be very practical in my response and talk about ensuring that for the folks that are listening to this today, that they bring that patient voice in everything that they do. And that's where it starts. And then it can build to some of those larger questions that you were asking. But I think we need to start with some very practical solutions.
We're heading into a world where we're of artificial general intelligence. Lots of people talk about it from a very dystopian view. But at the end of the day, we're already starting to see everything from Alexa to robotics to wearables to actually even having things like cognitive behavioral therapy in a Wobot, where it's like it's an online app where people are speaking about their mental health issues and everything in between. And we're only accelerating in that direction. So with all of that comes the responsibility of data privacy, and security, and what it means to do data sharing or owning, what it means to do data mining, how people are leveraging data lakes, and eventually the question of what is going to be the role of physicians. Will they eventually become very high paid data scientists, and who's going to be doing the analyses? But underlying all of this comes down to data. Do you have any thoughts on where we are going with that whole discussion? And is data security, even as a concept, going to be something that will meld and mold over time as well?
Again, I'm going to be really practical in my answers. So when I think about data and data in the world that I work in, the data that we get a lot and that we focus a tremendous amount on is information about cohorts of physicians and what their expertise is and what their areas of interest are. And I think that whether we're mining, using artificial intelligence to mine, to achieve that information through scouring through publications and conference abstracts or scouring through historical pieces of data to see how physicians have changed over time. All of those opportunities bring a richness to identifying, in my world, physicians that are very capable of helping us to achieve our goals. And without the use of that data and without the use of those analytics, I think that the richness and the diversity of the stakeholders that we would have would be very limited. And so it's a huge opportunity. I think that relying on the experts that are most versed and can really guide us through those decisions and those criteria to help us to create not only the identification, but to sort of boil the ocean, if you will, are really, again, critical business partners, critical thought partners. And for us, we've used the data to help us to identify physicians that we might not have otherwise had the chance to engage with, either by geography or by diversity of their expertise that we hadn't considered. And the data gives us the opportunities to build a very robust cohort of experts.
I love how you spun that in such a positive way, because oftentimes what you hear lately is about, the algorithm bias and how we're not, but I love the fact that really these algorithms and these data analytics have actually provided invention and exposure of people that you would have never spoken to before. So I absolutely love that. So Randi, we're kind of coming to the top of the hour. What is next for you? You've done so much in your career. You have explored so many things, both in the practical, strategic planning. You've straddled both commercial and medical. You obviously are a huge connector, and now exploring this world of digital. What is the next area of exploration for you?
Spreading it around. I think that there are very few companies who have done this well. There are very few companies that do it at all. And what I'd really like to see is more structure and process and strategy around how we engage with our most important stakeholders. And the more folks that I can talk to about the importance of this to drive towards their individual business goals, I think the better the work will be and the better the care to the patient will be. So for me, it's about the next few years, staying the course and continuing to build and explore the work that I've been doing and share it with more people so that more companies can serve more stakeholders and benefit more patients.
Absolutely. It sounds wonderful. And for those of you who are listening, we will be leaving a link to Randi's LinkedIn profile so that you could check that out, how to contact her, as well as the infographic that she's sharing on her profile that really speaks to the way to do effective stakeholder mapping and stakeholder management. And so she's got that as an infographic on her LinkedIn profile. So do invite you to go and check that out. And so for those of you who are also interested in these provocative discussions, these big, hairy, audacious, courageous conversations, this is exactly what we do at Impetus. We have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools so that you can actually connect with these thought leaders across the globe, payers, patients, physicians, allied healthcare providers. So you can discuss not only is what's going on with your brand, but what's going to happen in the future. What does the new digital economy look like? How are we going to have access to all? And how are we going to get past the digital divide? This and many more topics are all available for a series of touch points that you can create over time. So thank you to all of you for attending today. We look forward to getting your comments. Randi, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was a fun hour with you, Natalie. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.
Take care.